And welcome to episode 3 of All Things Betting and NBA podcast. If you're new here, my name is Monique, also known as Parlay Queen, and I have found a lot of joy in doing these podcasts, particularly for the NBA. What I like to target are matchups, whether they be marquee matchups, particular players going head to head, perhaps against a former team, and really trying to dissect those games, try to figure out exactly who to avoid, who we might be able to catch on a lower number, and hopefully make a whole lot of cash. I want to start things off a little bit differently here because we do have a bigger sample size now that we do have teams with more games played. It's really difficult early on in the season to figure out the true identity of teams, whether it's a team that's going through a new transition, albeit through the head coach, or just a team that's picked up a new player, trying to see how they gel with a current roster. So all of these things are particularly difficult betting early on in the season. So I wanted to take a look and pull up some of the standings overall and talk about some teams that are perhaps a little bit surprising or some teams that we expected to regress. So let's have a look at exactly that as I pull up some things on the screen to hopefully help you out. So here is my screen right now. We are going to be showing this. So here's a look at the NBA standings right now, East and West. We're not going to overcomplicate it. We're just going to have a look straight up at standings, discuss that, see what stands out. So the Cavaliers leading the way in the Eastern Conference, followed by the Celtics, Knicks, and the Magic. Now, a lot of these are teams that I am not particularly surprised to get out to hot starts, whether it be what happened to them last season, teams that play particularly well at home, some of them just really having that offensive success early on, and strength of schedule, also something to really consider. What is surprising as we scroll down the list? Well, two things that stand out, the Pacers, 76ers, and Bucks. All of them struggling early on in the season because of those injuries. Those are things that really, really stand out. The Pacers, I wouldn't say injury for them, just their struggles offensively to get things going. If you tuned into the first couple podcasts, you would know how I've been talking quite a bit about the struggles from Tyrese Halliburton from three, the struggles from the Pacers from beyond the arc, not really getting into gear the same way that we expected. This was a team that was so efficient offensively last year, and we haven't really seen that just yet. Of course, with the 76ers, injuries are something to really take into account. Joel Embiid, of course, Paul George, excited to see what he's going to be able to do with the 76ers this season. And the Bucks. Chris Middleton has been a cornerstone, a key piece. He's been so, so important for Milwaukee. Not only on the offensive end, which he's obviously most potent, but just on the defensive end too, giving another player an opportunity to score points outside of Giannis. We haven't really seen anyone step up the way that I would have liked to. Of course, we have the Raptors and the Pistons, two teams which we expect struggles in their near future. So taking a look at the Western Conference, Oklahoma City Thunder, boy, oh boy, what a fun team to watch. I was looking at an article that I saw earlier today where I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was along the lines of on opening day, the Oklahoma City Thunder have the youngest roster in NBA at age 24 was their average age for the players. So that's obviously really cool to be able to see them have the young players transition so well. Of course, scouting, everything goes into a young team. Having that chemistry, that mesh, that ability to blend well. We've seen that in spades out of them. We're going to talk about them as we feature them as one of the matchups to watch, but they have been so, so, so exciting and so much fun. The Phoenix Suns, Golden State Warriors. They are interesting and difficult to predict. Likewise with the LA Lakers, there is a ton of things. We'll talk about them in a little bit. I'm a little bit nervous, to be completely frank, with the Lakers defensively. We'll talk about that. The Mavericks at 3-2, the Kings at 3-2. The West is just so difficult and has been for quite some time. Then we got the bottom feeders, the Utah Jazz, Spurs, Clippers, Trailblazers, the Denver Nuggets. They had an interesting game that I watched yesterday. I'm pulling up the exact score. It was odd the way that there were so many momentum shifts in their matchup on Friday night. That, of course, was against the Timberwolves. In the fourth quarter, there was a bunch of back and forth. We had the Timberwolves with the big lead, then the Nuggets with the big lead. There was Minnesota able to come away with the win at home, 119-116. But they're a team that many expected that regression. So we will get right into it. Let's talk about some games that stand out. Just to reiterate, I'm doing this in advance. So I'm recording this midday on Saturday, and these games are going to be for Monday and Wednesday, of course, because we do have that break on Tuesday. So I just wanted to get things out early on. I want to give you the opportunity to see numbers that stand out. Obviously, capitalizing off of early lines, I think that goes a long way. And just having a little bit more of a kind of focal points in terms of what to dissect when the lines numbers do come out, of course, closer to tip off. So as I close this screen, let's get into some of the games that stand out for me. So I talked about marquee matchups being something that I really like to dissect. Not only are they usually the more competitive games, but I feel we have a pretty good grasp on a lot of teams' identities. So first things first, Celtics and Hawks. So the Hawks will be playing on a back-to-back. They're going to be playing the Pelicans, going to New Orleans to Boston Sunday night, heading into Monday night. I've been talking a lot about trends and stats and things that I think are really important. I know early on in the first podcast, I talked about the Lakers being a team playing on back-to-backs. You would think that because of their age, they'd be a team that you would be more hesitant, more reluctant to back on those back-to-back nights. We'll talk about the Hawks in here. So I'm going to pull up another screen here where we are talking about back-to-backs. Here we have the Hawks and their splits. So this is a website that I use a ton. I think it's one of the most useful ones that you can really come across, and that's Basketball Reference. Every single thing you need right here. We have the 2023-2024 Hawks, of course, still able to reference last year, where I think because of the larger sample size, it's really relevant. So scrolling down here to the team splits, this is so interesting to be able to see the wins and losses home and away. But what I want to hone in on is teams playing on no rest, 1 day rest, 2 day rest, 3 days plus, and being able to look at those numbers in particular and see if it is a huge discrepancy between their average points per game, field goal percentage versus what we see either on longer rest or shorter rest. So we're looking at them right now at the record playing on no days rest would be 6-9. So surprisingly, that's pretty average in terms of what we see. So circling back, the team with the best record on no rest last year were the Celtics at 12-2. The Suns, Bucks 10-4. So looking at it and seeing that record, really not all that bad whatsoever when we consider all things at 6-9 on no rest for the Atlanta Hawks. So pulling up this. So we're looking at it, we see 15 games played, 6 wins, 9 losses. No noticeable dips, I would say, in terms of the field goals attempted, the 3-point percentage, and just kind of points per game overall. So I like to look at this and say that this isn't a team that I'm all that concerned when they're playing on back-to-back nights. So I'm closing that momentarily. We are going to talk a little bit more about what I like in this matchup. So, the head-to-head. What comes to mind right away when I look at a team like this? So, first things first, Trae Young. I want to hone in on him in particular. So, the last 2 times these 2 teams met up, there was no Trae Young in those last two meetings. In the last three meetings overall, in terms of scoring, 125, 117, 120, 118, 123, 122, with the Hawks winning two straight. So we talked about no Trae Young in the last two meetings, and I think that's really important to point out. In terms of Trae Young in particular, in 4 of the last 5 games he has played versus Boston, he has had 10 or more assists. Now, thus far this season, what do we expect? What have we seen to this point? Well, he's putting up huge minutes. That's something we've seen out of him over the years. No game thus far has he played less than 36 minutes. And in only one of those games has he gone under 10 assists. So that is really, really interesting to point out, to look at, to really figure out. So in terms of the paint points, where does the Atlanta Hawks, where do they have the most success? Well, seeing them score in the paint is something that I think is really important, especially in a matchup like this. 66, 44, and 52 points in the paint through 3 matchups. Now, even in a blowout loss versus the Thunder, half of their points that the team scored came from inside the paint. That, to me, leads me to believe that this is a team that isn't going to settle for those outside perimeter shots. They're going to try to get inside. Of course, it's difficult enough to score against the Celtics in general, but I do think they will find the most success trying to get inside. Now, having someone like Trae Young, who is excellent inside the paint in terms of those layups, dishing the ball out as well, the kind of that dribble penetration we see out of him quite a bit. I really like Trae Young to have a good game from an assist perspective. So I'm pulling up some numbers to try to get some reference points in terms of what his assist total is going to be. And unfortunately, I don't really have anything great to go off of. Because he is a player that does usually get around that 10 assist mark, I think we're going to be looking at 9.5 as a number. But I feel like, kind of given him being that cornerstone for the Hawks having that offensive success, I think he's a good play to back on his assist total. When I don't know the exact number and I know it's going to be high, having one of those ladder bets in terms of taking him over an alternate number could be interesting. Maybe looking at him, let's say it is 9.5, perhaps taking him at 13 or 14, maybe even 16. A huge number, obviously, but you're getting rewarded mightily. So maybe that's something to consider. I think the sweet spot would be around that 15. I don't think I'd go much higher than that if you're looking at an alternate number, but why not? Especially considering these two teams do tend to play some of those higher scoring games. Let's take a look at the Knicks and Rockets. Of course, we haven't had an opportunity to break down a Knicks game yet, but this is a new look Knicks team. Head to head, when the Knicks and Rockets meet up, we have seen some very low scoring games. Now, these two teams don't play much. If we are going back to 2021, 5 of 8 times that these two teams have played, there's been one team that has been held under 100 points. That is very, very, very alarming considering how high scoring is in the NBA, even on average. So seeing that 5 of the 8 times there's been a team held under 100 points, that to me is likely to be really reflected in terms of the under-over for the game in general. But I feel like that's a very important trend. So what have I noticed about these two teams this year? Well, Rockets are shooting really poorly. They rank 29th in the association at 40.9%. These struggles are both home and away. Granted, it's early on. I'm going to pull up something that I think is extremely interesting as well in terms of the New York Knicks. As we go to this NBA stats page on team rankings that I talked about. So we're going to pull up for this year. We're going to go into the Knicks in terms of points per game and have a look at them. So here we are in New York at 116. So talked about scoring being way up. Of course, that puts them right in the middle of the pack. Right at the bottom there, we see the Jazz under 100. So we see the Knicks right here at 116. So we're going to look at shooting percentage right here as well. So we see the Knicks shooting 50.3%. That stands out to me, of course, but not massive splits in home and away. So shooting really, really well for both with a small sample size. Going to look at last year as well. Just kind of looking, talked to the Pacers, having that success early on. Of course, this is a new look Knicks team, 46.4, and then the points per game as well. So going into that, looking at last year for New York, we got in the middle of the pack here. So looking at that and looking at the Knicks in general, yeah, they're not scoring a ton of points, but having a good shooting percentage is really, really important. I talked about that with the Celtics last year in terms of pace of play, not playing at that particular fast of a pace at all. In fact, playing at one of the slower paces, but being effective and being efficient, going a long way. So for the Rockets, what I really think is interesting with the Houston Rockets, this is a team that's struggling to put up points. I was looking through particular stats with the Rockets. What kind of stands out? I expected them to have a really high turnover number, and that's not the case. The surprising thing is they're actually first in the league with the lowest number of turnovers per game at 9.8. So they're not turning the ball over much. They're struggling to put up points. They're struggling from the floor. What I find for them is they just don't have enough players that are making enough field goals. Looking at them in general, right now at this point, Jalen Green, 9.4 field goals made per game. Next, we got 5.4 with the rest of the team, 4 or less per game. That simply is just not going to cut it, especially when we are looking at scoring being so high and so high up just overall. I mean, last year, Pacers averaging 121.6 points per game. How are you going to be able to compete if you're really struggling to put up 100? So that stands out to me with the Houston Rockets. So looking at these numbers, seeing how they've played thus far, yes, their team total is going to be really low. That is certainly expected. If I can see them right now. So they do have a matchup against the Golden State Warriors on November the 2nd. So tonight, their team total right now is 110.5. So if we can get against the Knicks a team total maybe 108.5, I would definitely like to take the under. Would love to see something closer to 110 and really back them on the under. Talked about the struggles, the Knicks being good defensively, just the way that I think the game's going to play out. I really lean towards taking the team total for the Houston Rockets under. Switching gears entirely, Lakers and Grizzlies. Last matchup against the Lakers, we saw Anthony Davis with a season-high 38 points. It was the first win on the road for the Lakers this season, and that was against Toronto, 31-125. The score a little bit closer than you would expect in terms of how the game was playing out. This was a full control game by the Los Angeles Lakers from start to finish. 41 free throw attempts. That is enormous. I believe, if not mistaken, that was 3 times the number of attempts that the Raptors had. So obviously being aggressive, Toronto with the foul trouble, all of that stands out. But it was a really comfortable win from LA. Now the Grizzlies. They're coming off of a big win against the Bucks. They had a lead as high as 31 points. They got out to an extremely fast start. I talked about them being a team that likes to get out to those early beginnings, and they had exactly that. They had 70 points in the first half on 51% shooting. They held the Bucks to 42% from the floor. And more than anything, my big takeaway from watching that game was it wasn't so much that I thought the Grizzlies were playing great defense. It was the Bucks missing shots. They were taking a ton of shots from beyond the arc, and they just were not good. They just weren't falling. A lot of them were open looks too. So I'm not going to give any credit to the Grizzlies defensively, more so than I am kind of a negative and a slight on Milwaukee. But important to point out the offensive success they had early on. head-to-head, always like to point this out. So in the last 3 games in the head-to-head, Memphis has had a lot of success against the Lakers. 127, 124, and 120 points for what they've been able to put up. They've only won 1 of those 3 matchups. However, that was without Ja Morant. The Grizzlies are and have been the most difficult team when we're looking at team totals on the season and just talking about them. What are the expectations? What kind of effect are they going to have? How are they going to finish? Are they a playoff team? There's so many question marks because of how important Ja is to the team. So last year, 21 and 52 without Morant. Obviously, that speaks for itself. And last year, looking at it, they didn't have a very difficult schedule. Pulling them up and reading through the number, kind of looking at them in general, I do want to point this out because I think it is interesting. So I'm going to pull this up and then talk about the team. Let's pull them up. So the Memphis Grizzlies, we are going to look at the previous season here. Let me pull up this for you. So again, just taking advantage of a team that has, or a website that has some good numbers and things that are important. So right here, SRS is something that stands out. So that is exactly the simple rating system. So this is taking into account point differential, strength of schedule. Obviously, 0 is considered average. Nonetheless, this is something to point out. So points per game last season, 105.8, 30th of 30. Opponent points per game, they were good. They only gave up 112.8. Pace of play, kind of towards the middle of it. Defensively, they were a lot stronger than they were offensively. Look at their offensive rating, 30th of 30. And here we have a look at what was expected for the win-loss. And seeing them, they finished 13th in the West at 27 and 55. The reason I wanted to point this out, just in general, is to show you the importance of a player like this. And of course, you can dig down a little bit deeper, seeing how they played, field goal percentage on average, etc., how important it was with teams in particular, kind of the average points per game from some of these players. Desmond Bane is someone that I'm intrigued with to see once he's healthy. It was just so difficult to predict this team without the most important player on their roster. So kind of looking at it this season, I think they're off to a great start. And being able to see how amazing the start Ja is off to, that's really interesting. So talking a little bit more about them last season, they didn't have that difficult schedule, dead last points per game, offensive rating. Thus far, we've seen them play much more efficiently, a faster pace, way more points per game. They're currently 6th at 118.2. The Lakers, talked about them at the start, just being a team that is giving up a ton of points. They are giving up an average of 119 points per game on a league high 49.5% shooting for the opponents. Now, Ja Morant in particular, been talking a lot about him. What has he really been able to do against the Lakers? A lot of the numbers we've seen have been right around his season average, but some of the games that stand out to me, Morant putting up those big numbers, 39, 40, 41-point games. He's a difficult one to predict because his point total is going to be high for this matchup. If I were to hazard a guess, I would guess around 25 and a half. I think it's safer taking the Grizzlies to continue to have that success offensively like they have versus the Lakers and to take them as a team overall. Taking a wild guess, an educated guess, if you will, I think their team total is going to be somewhere around that 112 and a half. I like the over. I would play this as high as 1 and take the over on that. I think they're going to have a lot of success. I don't think the number is going to be that high. I think they're going to be able to put up quite a few points against LA, as historically do have that as a pretty good reference point. So lastly, we're going to talk about another matchup, and that being the Thunder and Nuggets. I have a lot of notes in here and a lot of things to potentially discuss in this matchup. 5-0 Thunder have been stellar, stellar defensively. They lead the league in opponent points per game at 98.6. The opponent shooting percentage, 39.4%, with the effective field goal at 46%. Seeing the Thunder and Nuggets, who have already played each other, it is really interesting to see these two teams play each other so early on, as we did see 102-87 for the Thunder victory. Now, the Thunder held them to 35.7% shooting, 7 of 38 from beyond the arc. Now, it was on the road, and both teams did struggle from beyond the arc and in terms of their shooting percentage overall. These are numbers that we're used to seeing out of these two teams when they do play. We tend to see very low scoring defensive games. I'm going to pull up the head-to-head in general, just so we can have a good reference point in here in terms of looking at the numbers as we look. The head-to-head here. So looking at their last couple meetings, there are things to really consider for these matchups. I like to look fairly far back if there hasn't been a considerable change or player that's had such an impact. We've had similar rosters for enough time that I feel like we can go fairly far back in here, but kind of from this January 22nd onward or what I want to hone in on, these low scoring matchups. So this Land of Basketball website I really like as well. Of course, clicking on the score in the last meeting, this was October the 24th, of course, talking about this matchup. And seeing where the scoring happened in terms of first half, second half, of course, got out to a faster start. Second half, much lower scoring, kind of digging down in terms of certain players, what stands out to them, total number of rebounds, offensive, defensive, shooting percentage for both squads over here. And then just kind of backpedaling to exactly this, just seeing some lower scoring numbers overall in general. So, what stands out in this matchup? Now, I expect this to be a low scoring matchup. Now, I'm stating the obvious. We have that one game sample size from the year already. And just seeing how these two teams tend to play low scoring games overall. Talked about 3 games where the teams were held under 100 or less. 5 of the last 6 saw one team score 100 or less as well. This is going to be a very low total for the game. I know that. I want to look at rebounding. When we have a low scoring total, I tend to find that there's particularly one player that tends to take advantage of exactly that. Now, looking at this right away, first thing that comes to mind, Jokic. His number is going to be high. I can guarantee that. Seeing him in the total for the matchup against the Jazz, it was 12.5. I'll talk about that in a bit. The standout to me for Oklahoma City, Chet Holmgren, he has had the opportunity to take advantage of some good playing time. 14, 16, 9 boards in 3 games, and he's been effective from the floor as well. Looking at the rebounding totals over the past few games, it is being reflected. I see him sitting at 9.5 in the matchup against the Clippers coming up. So this makes me want to look elsewhere. The fact that he is getting a lot of rebounds early on in the season, his season average is going to be inflated at this point. I want to look elsewhere. Here's a player we don't think about when we think about rebounding, but SGA, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. His rebounding total for the matchup against the Clippers is 5.5. Now, I look deeper into this and see in 4 of 5 games this season, he's gone over that number. Looking into his stats versus the Nuggets, he's had 7 in back-to-back games. So I find that really interesting. I think it is extremely intriguing considering there are likely to be some of those offensive struggles, I would say particularly out of Denver in this matchup. Now, circling back to Jokic really quick, I do much prefer SGA. He is going to be the play in here. We talked about Jokic. His rebounding total for the matchup against the Jazz is 12.5, as I mentioned. So I think it's going to be the same around OKC. Perhaps I don't think it'll be much higher. If anything, maybe 13 on the dot. And he has put up 13 or more in 4 of the last 5 in the head-to-head. I feel like this is a little bit riskier of a player to back in this spot because you do have Aaron Gordon, who is more than capable of putting up a double-digit rebounding total. So because he's going to have an inflated number, I do think it is going to be lower scoring. That is important to point out. But I feel like this could be one of those where the number is going to be really reflective on what we expect to see. Could he easily put up 18, 20? Absolutely. It's Jokic. But I do prefer SGA in this spot. Just kind of seeing the way that he's averaging a higher number of rebounds per game thus far, seeing the success he's had against Denver in the rebounding department. He's logging huge minutes. He's so there. He's always in the right spot. Naturally, just playing that way, the ball finds you. I think he's going to find SGA, as his total is likely to be 5.5. So he stands out to me. Just to do a little bit of a recap quickly, if you are just tuning in, some of the players I'm going to be targeting in particular for the Monday and Wednesday matchups. Trae Young, I do like his assists. I like the Rockets team total to be under whatever they set it at. I like the Grizzlies team total to be over whatever it's set at. For the Thunder and Nuggets, I like SGA to have that success at 5.5, likely to be his rebounding number. Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast. I hope it's been informative. As always, love to throw these numbers and stats out your way. They, to me, go an extremely, extremely long way. A lot of good references in terms of websites to help you with exactly that. It's not as old school as it once was, where we had to manually keep track of all of this stuff. But I do hope you found some good information in here. Now, on my Twitter page, of course, I will be updating the totals that when they do come out, I'm telling you if it's something that I want to avoid, if there's anything I want to add on. Always like to talk about that. But I feel I have a pretty good grasp on these matchups that stand out to me for next week. Best of luck with all of your plays, and hopefully you have an enjoyable weekend. If you're tuning into this on Monday, we can get those wagers then. Let's have another good night. Looking forward to it. Once again, you can find me on Twitter at Parlay Queen, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next time from All Things Betting Podcast.